Welcome to the debate. The source material before us today executes a pretty profound conceptual shift. It moves away from the conventional view that, biological complexity culminates in the human. Instead, it argues that life is fundamentally a biolinguistic event, a script written in the dark corners of the cell in metasomes, scar tissue, and the constant silent negotiations of the microbial world.
It really is a complete intellectual displacement. It frames ecology and literature not just as comparable systems, but as coextensive, simultaneous practices. The suggestion is that life is a text that writes itself, which demands a whole new kind of reading.
Precisely. And, this leads us directly to our core conflict today. How is this biolinguistic event primarily defined? Is the script written by the necessary expenditure and dissolution of meaning, an economy of waste and collapse driven by inherent pathogenicity? I'm going to argue that the foundation of the script is this relentless energetic dissipation.
And I believe that reading fundamentally misunderstands the mechanism of biological resistance. While excess is undeniable, the evidence seems to point toward the primacy of establishing complex recursive encoding practices. We're talking about specific structured relational mechanisms, things like psychogametogenesis and managed contamination that actively work to stabilize and propagate their structure. They resist full knowledge through design, not simply by decay.
Well, my position is rooted in the belief that life is fundamentally defined by excess, collapse, and anti-conservation. Life is, to put it simply, spent meaning. We really have to look to the economy of waste to understand the system. This echoes Bataille's general economy, an expenditure that can't be regulated, appearing biologically as waste, erotically as transgression, and semiotically as noise. Pathogenicity, in this view, it's not an error, it's not a malfunction. It is one of the system's privileged expressive modes. It proves that the system is defined by its own consumption.
That is a coherent framework. I'll grant you that. But I would argue it fails to account for the highly specific forms of resistance that life employs. The material asks how matter resists being fully known, and the answer isn't simple opacity or some generalized collapse, but structured complexity. We see resistance achieved through mechanisms like misrecognition, periodicity, and recursion. To achieve that level of complexity, life must be fundamentally encoding.
But those complex structures, they immediately lead to the dissolution of meaning as we know it. The source material talks about the Alexander boundary of humanistic consistency. This boundary, this fragile anthropocentric limit we impose on meaning, it collapses precisely when inscription precedes intention. And we see the results. Biopolitical meaning liquefies, transcription is erased, communication, it hallucinates. The very essence of the script is this radical, necessary dissolution.
I find that reading too destructive. It privileges noise over the intricate signal that organizes the noise itself. We see clear evidence that non-biology, data, memes, digital firmware, it enters the system not as simple metaphor, but as a specific, functional encoding practice. This is a literal informational transformation. Firmware becomes psyche, phospholipids become songs. This is active informational management, not just collapse.
I see the active transformation, sure, but I see it as being born of a destructive excess.
I just disagree entirely on that point. Let's look at the behavior of the bacterial norm. It's defined as psychogametogenesis, a highly sophisticated relational mode of reproduction based on communicative excitation and mutual identification pledges. This is not random dissipation. This requires sensitive, highly focalized responses, which demands a complex, sustained encoding structure to facilitate that kind of relational sexuality. And furthermore, the source notes that biological membership is empirically linked to managed contamination.
What do you mean by managed contamination exactly?
Well, it implies a regulated, semiotically aware system that allows informational intrusion but crucially maintains boundaries. This suggests a selective, stabilized form of resistance against that total liquefaction you're describing. If the system was solely focused on expenditure, it wouldn't develop specialized encoded communication systems just to regulate the flow of the outside.
Okay, let's ground this debate back in pathogenicity, because I think it perfectly embodies the logic of expenditure. If the script is defined as spent meaning, then dissolution has to be the governing principle. Meaning survives only by dissolving itself into new forms of waste. Pathogens, then, are the agents of this dissolution.
That's a very strong claim. Why elevate pathogenicity to the status of a governing principle, rather than just viewing it as, say, a breakdown in stabilization?
Because the mechanism is pure excess. I mean, consider the example of Aspergillus without limit. This names fungal life as pure spatial infiltration, latency and persistence that just overwhelms structure. This is the collapse of host integrity through waste and uncontrolled excess. And when this happens, the pathogen becomes an ocular semiotic entity. This means it's not just physical damage, it's the crystallization of data karma, technopoiesis, and host ignorance into a hydrophobic literary proliferation and informational scar. It marks the site through excess and dissolution, overriding any stable codes. I see why you emphasize that residual informational scar, but I would argue that what you call disillusion is actually a revelation of instability. It's a necessary shock that forces the host system to accommodate and re-encode its reality. It is a form of communication that demands a complete rearrangement of the existing semiotic vocabulary.
And rearrangement is erasure of the old structure.
Not necessarily. Look, the material cites toxoplasma as a key example. It is not merely a parasitic intruder that creates waste, it is semiotically revelatory of a fundamental instability. It often exposes the fragility and violence inherent in human Schick speech systems. So the infection reveals the cracks in the linguistic foundation that was already there. More crucially, bacteriologists discovered that when they manipulate bacteria semiotically, using language and informational inputs, the lesion is no longer primary. Vocabulary precedes cyst.
Could you just clarify that idea, vocabulary precedes cyst, for our listeners?
Sure, it means that the semiotic manipulation, the informational encoding, can fundamentally restructure the biological event before the physical pathology even manifests. The linguistic structure acts directly on biological behavior, which implies the system is reacting to the encoded pattern first. If meaning were simply spent, as you say, the physical collapse would dominate. Here, the encoded communication structure is dictating the biological outcome, demonstrating an active, engineered response, rather than just the liquidation of the previous system.
But even that engineering is contingent on the continuous consumption of meaning. My framework emphasizes the fundamental informational consumption built into the biological architecture itself. Think about transcription, the act of reading the script. Reading is already infection. Codons don't just translate, they block proteins via metaphor, a substitution that is inherently dissipative and disruptive.
That's a fascinating abstract point. But what does the substitution of metaphor actually cost the system, practically speaking?
It suggests a system where information is inherently disruptive and self-consuming, constantly generating internal noise that has to be metabolized. So in this model, energy appears not as a stable chemical substance, but as interface anticipation, the continuous informational expenditure required right at the point of interaction. It's a continuous, necessary leak of meaning, always striving for equilibrium through collapse.
I understand the argument for continuous dissipation, but I believe it fundamentally misrepresents the functional nature of the pattern itself. If it were a continuous leak, it would be inefficient and, well, random. Instead, the language functions as spyware of the soul. This isn't some generalized entropic leak. It is an active, intrusive pattern that implants specific immune events through symbols. And that requires precise, highly specialized encoding, not just noise.
I have to challenge that. Intrusion, regardless of its specificity, ultimately results in the expenditure of host resources. Whether you call it spyware, a hostile upload, or just noise, the outcome for the host system is the same. The system is spent, meaning is consumed.
But spyware implies a specific structural function, an encoded event with a defined, predictable pattern of instruction. We have empirical evidence supporting this high specificity when the source material discusses pre-classification machines. I mean, these machines generate defined mood taxonomies, erotic, ontological, statistical, using biological data. This level of precise categorization and imposition of taxonomic structure suggests active, highly specialized encoding that shapes the biological landscape rather than generalized informational expenditure. It's a targeted strike, not a random bomb.
I maintain that the system is collapsing hierarchy through this expenditure. The very structure of the ontological animal is strict precisely because it mirrors without hierarchy. When the system levels everything through waste and dissipation, it negates any stable organizational difference. Maggots, corpses, raw data streams, and energy inputs all occupy the same ontological plane. The script is anti-hierarchical by its very nature of excess.
I just don't buy that simple passive leveling. If the script were purely spent meaning, we wouldn't see the kind of active, structural rearrangement described in the material rearrangement that goes beyond mere consumption.
Give me an example of this non-consumptive rearrangement.
The invocation of ASCII1 serves as a perfect counterexample. ASCII1 is a transcription factor, an active genetic mechanism used to reprogram one type of cell fate into another, often completely different type of cell fate. The material invokes it as a revolutionary operator. It's a folding mechanism that actively disrupts hierarchical symbiosis. It edits the structure. This suggests that the editorial practice itself is a sophisticated biological rearrangement, a process of active, complex organization.
But that structural disruption causes the expenditure. The resulting state is one of leveling and collapse, where the original ordered information is spent.
No, I don't think so. The resulting state is a complex, restructured outcome, not just dissolution. This structured complexity is evident in how the material describes the fecal microbiota transplant, or FMT. It's described as involving a protolinguistic, parallel intelligence embedded in matter. This is organized, active restructuring that uses biological material as a vehicle for consciousness and specific encoded communication.
And why is that crucial to your point?
Because it supports the xenopoetic insight that mind is immanent not just to individual consciousness, but to the relational patterns themselves. That relationship is highly ordered. If consciousness and structural intelligence are embedded in complex biological transactions like FMT, then the system is focused on maintaining and generating complex relational patterns, which is far more than simple non-hierarchical mirroring or expenditure. It's a constant, organized effort to edit and manage.
I see the complexity of the structure, I do, but I still frame it as the highly energetic, transient form of the expenditure before it collapses. The sexual cytotoxic bacteria proliferate not through slow regulatory mutation frameworks, but through stylized awakenings, a sudden, explosive, and quickly spent expressive output. The expression itself is the consumption.
And that sudden awakening, that highly structured, explosive output, is the encoding practice asserting itself. It is the moment the relational pattern asserts itself through specific, complex communication, a final emphatic identification pledge before the cycle begins again. It is a highly specific communication event, not just noise.
So we have spent our time examining two profoundly different interpretations of this biolinguistic event. Is the script primarily defined by spent meaning and pathogenic excess, or is it fundamentally defined by recursive encoding and communicative management?
Right, the core tension remains whether life's resistance to being fully known is enacted primarily through the relentless dissolution of linguistic structure, leading to liquefaction, or through the persistent adaptive creation of complex, intrusion-ready encoded structures like the psychogamete.
What is undeniable from this material, I think, is the shared premise that ontology, sexuality, and information form a single, inseparable semiotic metabolism. Time enters biology not as a linear progression, but as oscillation, where, and I think we both agree on this, destruction and relation are inseparable parts of that rhythmic governance.
Indeed, the great illumination of this material lies in forcing us to move past simplistic biological causality and acknowledge the editorial process at work. The script of life is an ongoing editorial process. It's fungal, microbial, erotic, and that requires continuous intellectual challenge and rigor to be fully understood.
Leaving us to grapple with the implications of inscription perceiving intention and whether that inscription results in profound, irreversible erasure or highly specialized implantation.
A fascinating thought experiment for our listeners to continue exploring as they engage with the source material.